Chopin's English Variations and Scottish Intermezzo by Michał Karski.
There were two big stories in Europe in November 1849, at least from the point of view of my editor back in the United States. One was the death of Chopin in October, and the other was the possibility of an American tour by Jenny Lind. Since I was the Paris correspondent at the time, I was assigned to cover the story about Chopin. And as it turned out, the first person to tell me about him was, in fact, Jenny Lind herself. I met her in the lounge of one of the big Parisian hotels.
Yes, it was very sad news about Chopin, but I think we were all expecting it. His health had been so poor and getting worse and worse over the last few years. It was good to see so many people at his funeral, and I'm glad that I managed to see him here in Paris before the end. People from the newspapers have been asking me all sorts of questions. Is it true you'll be touring America, Miss Lind? Did you ever perform on the same stage as Monsieur Chopin? Is it true that you admired him very much as an artist, Miss Lind? I imagine they'd like very much to ask me whether there was anything between us. Jenny Lind, the Swedish Nightingale, and Frédéric Chopin. It would make a fascinating story, no doubt. But I'm not about to encourage any speculation. Frédéric was Frédéric. He was indeed an artist I admired very much. The fact the feeling was mutual does not give anyone the right to assume anything more. Newspapers should keep to the known facts.
Our paper always sticks to the facts, Miss Lind. Please continue.
Well, Mr. Franklin, I certainly don't mind recalling for you the year before his death, which was when I first met him. That year, 1848, which is already being called the Year of Revolutions, was certainly a turbulent one for Chopin, and it was also the last time he ever played in public. The occasion was not a glittering Parisian salon where he was used to displaying his talents to a select and appreciative audience, which invariably included many of his French and Polish friends. Instead, on the 16th of November, Chopin found himself responding to a request to play at a ball for the benefit of the veterans of the 1831 Polish uprising. According to people who were there, his performance was out of place at the venue. People were more interested in dancing than listening to his exquisite but subdued playing. Chopin, who was renowned throughout Europe for his artistry, was hardly noticed that night. Unusually, there were no newspaper reviews of his performance.
That certainly was unusual, Miss Lind. Where was this venue?
It was the Guildhall in London. Back in the 1830s, Chopin had travelled around Europe quite extensively while he was living in Paris, but it was not until 1837 that he made his first trip to England. It was a rather spur-of-the-moment decision, and he travelled with his friend, the piano manufacturer Camille Pleyel, who was going to be spending a few weeks in London. They arrived on the 7th of July. This was a period when Chopin was still unattached. He was hoping to marry Maria Wodzinska, whom he had met several years earlier in Warsaw. He fell in love with her when they met again years later in Dresden. Before his departure for London, he had also made the acquaintance of the writer Amandine Dupin, better known by her pseudonym Georges Sand, with whom he was to have a long relationship in later years. At that point in his life, he did not find her particularly attractive. London fascinated Chopin. He was impressed by the city, by English women, by the wealth, the palaces and the greenery, and the fact that everything was well ordered and prosperous. Unfortunately, he found the atmosphere grey and oppressive, and was soon in coughing fits. His guide around London was an old friend from Warsaw, Stanisław Koźmian, the poet. They spent the days seeing the city and the evenings at the opera. Koźmian wrote to his family, telling them that Chopin wanted to maintain anonymity while in the city. His failing health was beginning to make him reluctant to socialize.
Od 2 tygodni jest tu Chopin incognito. Nikogo nie zna, z nikim się nie chce
Chopin has been here for 2 weeks incognito. He doesn't know anyone, he doesn't want to see anyone.
However, the deception did not last long. Pleyel's English counterpart, the piano maker James Broadwood, invited Pleyel to a dinner one evening. When Pleyel said he could not very well leave his travelling companion alone all night, not mentioning that it was the famous Chopin himself, Broadwood insisted that Pleyel bring him along. Chopin was introduced to the gathering as Monsieur Fritz. After dinner, a few individuals played the piano, a few ladies sang, and Chopin found he could not resist the temptation. Pleyel informed Broadwood that Monsieur Fritz was quite an adept pianist, and so he was invited to play. Chopin proceeded to stagger the assembled gathering with his virtuosity. The incognito fell apart. No one but Chopin can play like that, they all agreed. He played several of his own compositions, this time as Frédéric Chopin, and ended up improvising on any given theme.
So that was Chopin's first taste of London. As far as I know, he didn't perform publicly in those few weeks. 11 years later, he travelled to England again. What prompted his second visit, since the London climate didn't seem to agree with him? Did he get offers to play which were too good to turn down?
Well, not exactly. The next time Frédéric travelled to England, he was seriously considering permanent residence. The political situation had changed completely. The revolutionary year of 1848 had produced great instability in Paris, and Chopin's salon engagements had dried up as the aristocracy deserted the capital. Moreover, he had broken off his long-standing relationship with Georges Sand. There seemed to be no good reason to stay in France. His Parisian friends thought they'd lost him forever. One of these was Wojciech Grzymała.
Yes, indeed, my dear Mr. Franklin. Chopin was a very good friend, and we shall all miss him greatly. And the world of music has lost a true genius. You say Miss Lind has already told you about his first trip to England.
Mm-hmm.
Now let me tell you about his second visit. Chopin reached London on the 20th of April of last year. He had actually been invited to Great Britain by two Scottish sisters, Miss Jane Sterling, a piano pupil of his in Paris, and Mrs. Catherine Erskine, whom he had also met in France. They took on the role of guardian angels and catered to his every whim. Chopin's London friend Kozmian also undertook to look after him again during his stay, and this time he was assisted by Major Karol Żółkiewski. Jane and Catherine provided him with an apartment in Bentinck Street near Cavendish Square. Chopin soon moved to Dover Street near Piccadilly, to an apartment facing the sun and boasting 3 pianos supplied by Pleyel, Erard and Broadwood. He was very pleased with it, as was clear from what he wrote to his friends.
Znalazłem wreszcie pokój, piękny i duży, w którym mogę grać i oddychać.
At last I found a beautiful big room in which I can play and breathe.
Everything proved expensive, however. He had to keep a servant and maintain a carriage. Walking anywhere was exhausting for him. He immediately found himself caught up in a whirl of social engagements and invitations to the homes of the English aristocracy. Just days after his arrival, he was invited to play at Lady Gainsborough's. Another evening, he was invited to play for the Marquis of Douglas. Chopin wrote to his family in Poland about the contacts he had made among the English beau monde, listing many a glittering aristocratic name. He was being paid, of course, for these appearances, and he soon added fees for piano lessons to his income. On the 4th of May, Chopin went to see a young Swedish soprano who was singing in Bellini's La Sonnambula. This was, of course, none other than Jenny Lind, who had already made a name for herself throughout all of Europe. She impressed him very much. The society hostess, Mrs. Grote, introduced them, and they immediately took to each other, spending much time together. Chopin wrote about her enthusiastically.
Dobra dziewczyna i jesteśmy z sobą doskonale.
She's a fine girl and we get on splendidly. As an actress and singer, she is utterly beautiful.
He got on so well with her that apparently he ended up confiding in her. About his mixed feelings for Georges Sand, for example. In fact, and I'm telling you this strictly entre nous,
Off the record, as we say, sir, I'm the soul of discretion.
there has even been talk of a love affair between Miss Lind and Chopin.
I've heard those rumours myself, and I have to say that I've never understood the need for secrecy. But, be that as it may, not everything has to find its way into the newspapers. Please continue, sir.
Chopin was also introduced to many eminent people of the day, such as the historian Thomas Carlyle, the American essayist and philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson, and the novelist Charles Dickens. The most splendid evening he had was on the 15th of May at the Duchess of Sutherland's. Chopin described it in another of his many letters to his family.
Miałem kilka świetnych wieczorów, jakem tylko przyjechał i nie wiem, czym wam z Londynu pisał, że księżna Sutherland miała raz u siebie królowę na obiedzie i wieczorem tylko z 80 osób z pierwszego świata londyńskiego. Księżna mnie królowej prezentowała, królowa grzeczna 2 razy ze mną mówiła. Książę Albert przybliżył się do fortepianu, powiedzieli mi wszyscy, że to rzadkie rzeczy.
I had several splendid evenings as soon as I arrived. I don't know if I wrote to you from London that one evening the Duchess of Sutherland even invited the Queen for dinner, and there were around 80 people from London's high society there. The Duchess introduced me to the Queen, who was very courteous and spoke to me twice. Prince Albert even came over to the piano. Everyone told me that these were very rare occurrences.
On the 23rd of June, Chopin gave his first public concert in front of 150 people at Eaton Place, the home of the singer Lady Adelaide Sartory, the daughter of the famous actor Charles Kemble and a great supporter of Chopin in England. He played mazurkas, waltzes, études and his berceuse. He was not very well and his playing was rather subdued. The writer Thackeray was in the audience and described the performance as very pretty music. It seems that Chopin did not make an impression with either the power or precision of his playing, as did other pianists such as his friend Franz Liszt. On the 7th of July, he gave a matinee concert at the house of Lord Falmouth. The singer Pauline Viardot also took part and sang her own arrangements of Chopin's mazurkas. The concert was a great success and the press reviews were in general favourable. He was an original genius as a composer, according to the Daily News. Jane Carlyle, wife of the famous historian, wrote about all this to Jane Stirling.
I prefer his music to all others, for it is not a specimen of art offered to the general admiration, which is the effect that most music has upon me. It is rather the reflection of part of his soul, and a fragment of his life lavished on those who have ears to hear and a heart to understand. I think that each of his compositions must have taken away from the number of days allotted to him. Oh, how I wish he understood English. How I wish I could open my heart to him.
Thank you for your time, Miss Lind. I met Mr. Gzimawa yesterday and he says he'll give me plenty of information tomorrow. Meanwhile, perhaps you'd be kind enough to tell me some more about Chopin's stay in England? I've heard all about his early successes, the concert at the House of Lord Falmouth.
I see you're keeping very detailed notes, Mr. Franklin. I trust that... How shall I phrase this? I trust that you won't elaborate on what I've been telling you.
Of course not, Miss Lind. Our newspaper is not in the habit of making up stories.
Thank you. I shall be happy to tell you all I know about Chopin's time in England. Your readers may want to know just how much of an effort it was for him to perform in public during these months. Despite his success, Chopin found it difficult to cope with the English climate and the whirl of social engagements. He was quite unable to compose the way he had at Georges Sand's country house in France during previous summers, where the peace and quiet and family atmosphere allowed him to concentrate on his music. He found London simply too exhausting. Kosmian described Chopin's state of mind in one of his letters.
Przyjazd jego do Anglii był wypadkiem w świecie muzycznym, a pobyt ciągiem nieprzerwanych triumfów. Ale Chopin nie brał już żadnego w tej pomyślności udziału. Smutnym i przygnębionym był, choć mu zdrowie nadspodziewanie służyło.
His arrival in England was a great event in the world of music, and his stay a constant succession of triumphs. But Chopin did not feel up to celebrating this success. He was sad and depressed, although his health still served him unexpectedly well.
It was about this time that the local Polish émigré community, aware of Chopin's presence in the capital, decided to hold a banquet in his honour. The assembled company numbered about 30 people, and they toasted him and sang his praises, hailing him as a great Polish artist. Chopin rose, and instead of making a speech to show his gratitude, invited them all back to his rooms for an evening of piano music. Everyone went back to Dover Street, where Chopin, although tired and ill, proceeded to regale the delighted company with mazurkas and polonaises until 2 o'clock in the morning. Despite being enlivened by his successes, Chopin was still subject to frequent and severe coughing fits, particularly in the mornings, often spitting blood. He tried to avoid physical exertion and concentrated on giving piano lessons. But as soon as he felt slightly better, he tended to forget his doctor's orders to be careful. He was soon travelling all over southern England, making tiring carriage journeys to Brighton, Cambridge, Colchester, Gloucester and elsewhere. Naturally enough, the strain affected his health. Eventually, having spent over 3 months in London, Chopin was persuaded that the fresher air of Scotland would be better for his breathing, and on the 5th of August he left the capital and journeyed north.
Well, my friend, Miss Lind was quite right. I can probably tell you more about Chopin's time in Scotland because he was forever writing to me. He really seemed to be missing all his friends in Paris by that time.
Miss Lind told me that he left London on the 5th of August.
Absolutely right. Chopin reached Edinburgh after a 12-hour train journey of over 400 miles, his head filled with romantic
Excuse me, sir, can I just interrupt you? You said 400 miles in 12 hours? Let me see that. I calculate that the train covered a distance of over 30 miles in just 1 hour.
Indeed, Mr. Franklin. It was the express train. As I was saying, Chopin's head was filled with the romantic visions of the beautiful country of Sir Walter Scott. He was not disappointed. Edinburgh delighted him. Nevertheless, exhausted by the journey, he needed to rest for the whole of the following day. His guide around Edinburgh was Dr. Wyszynski, a Polish émigré who had settled in the city. Chopin found a welcoming family atmosphere at his home. He was greatly impressed by his surroundings, as can be seen from what he wrote to his family.
Zwiedziłem miasto
I have
przepiękne.
discovered an utterly beautiful city.
He was soon spirited away by his Scottish ladies, the sisters Jane Stirling and Mrs. Erskine, to stay with one of their relations at a castle 12 miles outside Edinburgh. Calder House was the ancestral seat of Lord Torfichan, with splendid house and grounds. Chopin had 2 pianos at his disposal, a Broadwood and a Pleyel. The sisters made him as comfortable as possible, even supplying him with the daily Parisian papers, but he found himself unable to compose. He was surrounded by beautiful Scottish melodies, yet, as he wrote to us in Paris, he could not think of a single melody of his own. He felt distracted, too much in demand, his attention required by the many other house guests at the stately home. It turned out that the climate did not suit him after all, and he again found himself spitting blood, although he tried to make light of the true state of his health in the letters he wrote to his friends.
Earlier in London, Chopin had agreed to play a concert in Manchester on the 28th of August. The Scottish sisters, Miss Stirling and Mrs. Erskine, arranged for him to stay at the home of one of their friends, an affluent Manchester industrialist. An advertisement appeared in the Manchester Guardian earlier in the month.
The directors beg to announce to the subscribers that a dress concert has been fixed for Monday, the 28th of August next, for which the following performers have been engaged: Signora Alboni, Signora Cobari, Signor Salvi, and Monsieur Chopin.
Whenever he prepared for a concert, Frédéric would play Bach rather than his own music. Bach, along with Mozart, was always his revered and favourite composer. Actually, Frédéric had misgivings about the size of the venue. The hall seated 1,200. This would be his largest audience so far, and he felt that his playing might be lost. Nevertheless, the concert was a success. The orchestra played 3 overtures by Weber, Beethoven and Rossini. Chopin performed his Andante and a Scherzo, a Nocturne, Etude, a Mazurka, the Ballade in F minor, a Waltz and the Berceuse. The Manchester Guardian Review on the 30th of August called the concert the most brilliant of the season.
With the more instrumental portion of the audience, Monsieur Chopin was perhaps an equal feature of interest with Alboni, as he was preceded by a high musical reputation. Chopin appears to be about 30 years of age. He was very spare in frame, and there was an almost painful air of feebleness in his appearance and gait. This vanishes when he seats himself at the instrument, in which he seems for the time perfectly absorbed. Chopin's music and style of performance partake of the same leading characteristics: refinement rather than vigour, subtle elaboration rather than simple comprehensiveness in composition, an elegant, rapid touch rather than a firm, nervous grasp of the instrument. Both his compositions and playing appear to be the perfection of chamber music, fit to be associated with the most refined instrumental quartet and quartet playing, but wanting breadth and obviousness of design, and executive power to be effective in a large hall. These are the impressions from hearing Monsieur Chopin for the first time on Monday evening. He was warmly applauded by many of the most accomplished amateurs in the town, and he received an encore in his last piece, a compliment thus accorded to each of the 4 London artists who appeared at the concert.
The Manchester Courier was also enthusiastic.
We can with great sincerity say that he delighted us, though we did not discover in him the vigour of Thalberg. Yet there was a chasteness and purity of style, a correctness of manipulation combined with a brilliance of touch and delicate sensibility of expression, which we never heard excelled.
After his Manchester concert, Chopin returned to Scotland, this time staying at Johnstone Castle just outside Glasgow, another of the many places to which he had been invited. Then it was on to Lady Murray's, further north and west. His letters to us in Paris witness him dissatisfied about his itinerant lifestyle, even though everyone tried to make him feel welcome and at ease.
Włóczę się od lorda do lorda, od jednego księcia do drugiego, wszędzie obok nieograniczonej swobody i największej serdeczności znajduję doskonałe fortepiany, piękne obrazy i doborowe biblioteki.
I'm carted around from lord to lord, from one duke to another, but everywhere I find unlimited freedom, the greatest cordiality, and superb pianos, beautiful paintings, and exquisite libraries.
He wrote to us complaining that he felt unwell and lonely, even though he is surrounded by people. His lack of fluency in English was also, of course, a problem, although it seems his hosts made every effort to speak French. All the same, Chopin grumbled that the conversation of the great Scottish families seemed to consist entirely of genealogy, of who was descended from whom. There is little doubt that the Scottish climate had not been as beneficial to his health as he had hoped. He was tired and ill, and wished he could settle in one place long enough to be able to concentrate on his music, like during the many summers spent in the French countryside with Georges Sand and her family. Chopin also wrote, almost as an afterthought, about a rather dramatic incident.
Zapomniałem ci napisać, że od czasu ostatniego mego listu miałem dziwny wypadek, który szczęściem na niczym się skończył, ale mógł mnie życie kosztować.
I forgot to mention that since my last letter I had a strange accident. We were driving out towards the sea. The carriage I was in was a coupe with 2 beautiful young thoroughbred English horses. One of them started to prance, caught its foot, and then began to kick. The other one did the same, and then, when they began to bolt down a slope in the park, the reins broke free, and the coachman fell from his seat. He was terribly bruised. The carriage was being battered from tree to tree and was smashed to pieces. We were heading for a precipice when a single tree stopped the carriage. One of the horses broke free and ran away madly, while the carriage itself fell on top of the other one. Branches had broken the windows. Luckily nothing happened to me except for some bruising on my legs from the battering we had received. The servant had jumped off skillfully, and only the coupe was damaged and the horses were injured. People who had seen it from a distance were shouting the 2 men were dead, since they had seen one thrown off and the other falling to the ground. Before the horse could move off again, I was able to get out of the carriage relatively unhurt. Neither we nor the people watching could understand how we had escaped being crushed to a pulp. I have to confess to you that I saw my last hour approaching quite calmly. Only the thought of broken legs and arms filled me with terror.
On Wednesday, the 27th of September, Chopin gave a matinee concert in Glasgow, which also featured the singing of Madame Adelacio de Marguerite. John Muir Wood, the pianist and music publisher who helped sell tickets for the event, was told that so many carriages had never been seen at any concert in town. It was a great success. The Glasgow Courier wrote a very favourable review, mentioning Chopin's grace and ingenuity at the piano.
Monsieur Chopin's treatment of the pianoforte is peculiar to himself, and his style blends, in beautiful harmony and perfection, the elegant, the picturesque, and the humorous. The pianist produces, without extraordinary effort, not only pleasing but new musical delights. Madame Adelacio has a beautiful voice, which she manages with great ease and occasional brilliancy. She sang several airs with much taste and great acceptance. We may mention that all the pieces were rapturously applauded, and the audience separated with expressions of the highest gratification.
Chopin himself thought that he had played better than at any of his concerts in England. Another concert in Edinburgh on the 4th of October was equally well received, and another glowing review appeared in the Edinburgh Courant.
This talented pianist gratified his admirers by a performance on Wednesday evening in the Hopetoun Rooms, where a select and a highly fashionable audience assembled to welcome him on his first appearance in Edinburgh. Chopin's compositions are amongst the best specimens of classical excellence in pianoforte music. Of his execution we need say nothing further than that it is the most finished we have ever heard. He has neither the ponderosity nor the digital power of a Mendelssohn, a Thalberg, or a Liszt. Consequently, his execution would appear less effective in a large room, but as a chamber pianist he stands unrivalled. Notwithstanding the amount of musical entertainment already afforded to the Edinburgh public this season, the rooms were filled with an audience who, by their judicious and well-timed applause, testified their appreciation of the high talent of Monsieur Chopin.
Did Monsieur Grimauer mention that Frederick's health was getting worse by the day? In fact, when he was staying with his friends the Wyszynskis in Edinburgh, he felt so poorly that apparently he wrote down his last will. At this very time, he received a surprising letter from none other than Wojciech Grimauer, wishing him well on his forthcoming marriage. It seems a rumour was circulating among his friends in Paris that he was engaged to be married to Miss Jane Stirling, the elder of the two sisters, and this would explain why he was being shuttled from one castle to another in Scotland, in order to be introduced as Miss Stirling's fiancé. Frederick, although fond of the sisters and grateful to them, sometimes found their attentions overbearing and irritating. There was no question in his mind of getting married to Jane, 6 years his senior. Profoundly depressed by his state of health, he replied to Monsieur Grimauer that he was closer to a coffin than to a marriage bed. Friends were advising him to spend the winter in London, but he was undecided. He eventually made the journey back to England in October. His friend, Major Szulczewski, installed him in an apartment in St. James's Place. Although he was homesick for Paris and all his close friends in France, and although the approaching English winter was threatening a greater deterioration in his health, He was reluctant to go back, in case he should meet George Sand. He was still bitter about the way they had parted, and blamed her for breaking off their relationship. He was not usually interested in politics, but now he was following events in France closely. He had met Prince and Princess Czartoryski in Edinburgh. They and other leading lights of the Polish expatriate community of Paris were living in Britain at the time. They seemed in no hurry to go back, so Frederic tarried in London, despite the approaching fogs of winter and his doctor's advice to leave the city. His neighbour in London was Lord Dudley Stewart, a great advocate of the Polish cause, and involved with the Literary Association of the Friends of Poland. This organisation had been established by, among others, the renowned Julian Ursyn-Niemcewicz during his time in England. Chopin was invited to play at a fundraising concert and ball in aid of Poles in England, particularly the veterans of the 1831 uprising. Despite his failing health, he would not turn down an opportunity to support such a worthy cause, asking his doctors to prepare him somehow for his appearance, to stiffen him up, as he put it. He played at the Guildhall on the night of the 16th of November.
And you said before, Miss Lind, that the London newspapers didn't even mention this event? I'm sure that our American papers would have been very keen to review any of Mr. Chopin's recitals.
Well, the newspapers did review the event itself, but what was strange is that none of them mentioned the fact that Chopin had appeared. His performance, by all accounts a marvel, considering his poor health, was somewhat out of place in a venue where most of the participants were only interested in dancing. They came to listen to him in the hall in which he played, while they were en route from one dance to another. Few people, if any, would have realised then that Frederick was giving his last public concert. The onset of the fogs of a London winter and the advice of his doctors finally convinced him to leave London immediately. On the 23rd of November, he was taken to the train station by James Broadwood's son, Henry Broadwood, another person who had made his stay in Britain as comfortable as possible. Soon he was on the journey back to Paris, accompanied by Leonard Niedźwiecki, whom Prince Czartoryski had recommended as a travelling companion. This would be the last time he ever saw England.
Miss Lind, thank you for your time and patience.
Not at all, it's been a pleasure.
And if you do decide to tour the United States, may I wish you every success. I'm sure they'll love you there.
Why, thank you very much, Mr. Franklin.
Thanks again, Miss Lind. I do appreciate it. I'm sure it couldn't have been very easy for you talking about Chopin like this.
It isn't, as a matter of fact. But even though he's gone, his marvellous music lives on. You'll probably have gathered that I prefer people not to know that Chopin and I were really close at one point, because, and I hope this doesn't sound too selfish, I don't want my own...
In Chopin's English Variations and Scottish Intermezzo by Michał Karski. Alex Karski was Franklin, Iwona Makowska was Jenny Lind, Tom Wachtel was Wojciech Grzymała, Michał Karski was Koźmian, and Annalise Mroczek was Jane Carlyle. Other parts were played by members of the cast. Peter Caton played the Largo from the Sonata in B minor, Opus 58, the Nocturne in F minor, Opus 55, No. 1, the Mazurka in F minor, Opus 68, No. 4, and the Vivace from the Sonata in B minor, Opus 58. Sam Haywood played the Nocturne in D-flat major, Opus 27 No. 2, the Polonaise in A-flat major, Opus 53, the Ballade No. 4 in F minor, Opus 52, the Scherzo No. 1 in B minor, Opus 20, and the Scherzo No. 2 in B-flat minor, Opus 31. Agnieszka Pluta played the Nocturne in C minor, Opus 48 No. 1, the Grand Valse Brillante in E-flat major, Opus 18, the Fantasy in F minor, Opus 49, and the Valse in A-flat major, Opus 34 No. 1. All recordings used with the permission of the copyright holders, the Royal College of Music for the recordings of Agnieszka Pluta, and the Cobb Collection for the recordings of Peter Caton and Sam Haywood playing on Chopin's original pianos at the Cobb Collection Trust, Hatchlands Park, Surrey. The editor was Tom Wachtel. This was a Perlocution production in association with Radio Orwa.